Thanks for having me. I love coming to B&H. I mean, David said, let's make it worth my trip, but it's always worth my trip because, excuse me, I love where I live. I live in Missoula, Montana, but I grew up on the East Coast, and so most of my life I've been visiting New York City, and obviously I love coming to New York City once a year and getting my dose of the city and the art and the food and the people, so I love coming here. And I love teaching at B&H because it's always a captive, excited audience. And they pretty much let me teach any topic that I want to, which is very exciting. So this lecture is going to be about learning the language of a photograph through critique, kind of a wordy title there. But the point is that I've taught a lot of courses in visual design before and composition. Most of what I teach for the last 10 years has been always associated with the visual side of photography. And I'm really interested in the creative cycle and the creative process. And as I said earlier, and as David said, I've also been a photo history teacher and buff for a long time. So those are the topics that I like to teach. I think it's very important to teach the technical aspects of photography, but there's lots of other people doing that. I've done that before. For me, I think there's a lot less people talking about the visual aspects of photography and the creative side of photography. So that's kind of where my passion lies. So my idea for this class is to learn the language of the photograph, but also hopefully by the end of this class, you'll all have some skills in critiquing photographs as well, or talking about photographs, because that is a skill. It's not something that comes naturally, and I'm sure any of you in this room who've been, how many people here have had their images critiqued before? Okay, right. So you know that sometimes critiques are effective and good, and sometimes not so much, right? You all know that it's a skill. So we're gonna talk about how to do that. So let's get started. Really, we're learning the parts of the photograph, the language about talking about photographs in order to give feedback to other people about their photographs, but then also in order to be able to talk about our own. And so, you know, I've been a teacher for a very long time. I've interacted with a lot of students, and there might be some of you even sitting here in the room thinking this, right? And I would agree that we are visual people and that our images, it's important if our images can say a lot, but we also live in a world of language. We live in a world where we talk to each other. And there's going to be some time in your life as a photographer where you're going to either have to talk about your own work, write about your own work, write an artist statement, write a proposal, or someone goes, what kind of photography do you do? Or why do you do photography, right? So I agree that we are visual people and our images being strong and speaking for themselves is a great thing, but I also think that we need to understand how to talk about photographs as well. So some initial thoughts about critiques that I think are kind of important to just set the guidelines here is, first of all, they are subjective, right? They come from each of our own history and perspective and opinions. And whether you are the person giving the feedback or getting the feedback, it's always important to remember this, right? But we're going to talk about in the lecture how to make it a little more objective, how to make it constructive feedback, right? Because I think that's a really important thing. I think when you're talking about photographs to other people and giving feedback, it's really important to go beyond whether you like or dislike the image. You're always going to have that immediate reaction of liking or disliking an image. But imagine as a teacher who's been teaching for over 15 years with thousands and thousands of students, you can't imagine that I would like every single image that I've critiqued in my life, right? But it's my job to help that person, to give them constructive feedback and to help guide them into why I personally think, perhaps, that the image could be better, why or how, okay? So it has to go beyond whether we just like or dislike the image. It's important, and I see this a lot, it's important to address the photograph that's in front of us, right? How often have you been in a situation where someone critiquing images starts going off into some other photograph, what it should have been, could have been, might have been, or what they would have done with a photograph, right? I mean, maybe there's a time and place for that, but it's really important to just talk about the photograph that's right in front of you. That's the image we're talking about. Is there any other information that can help? Meaning, is there a title to the image, right? Is there an artist statement or a statement of intent that goes with it? Is there a caption? Because we all know when there's captions or titles, it can really change the context of the image. So when we're critiquing images, it's important to know if there's any other elements that go along with it that can help tell the story. And then that really gets back to, can we get to the intention of the photograph? Now, we can't always do this. The only way, perhaps, that we can know what the intention was from the photographer is if the photographer is there and we can talk to them, which is a great thing. Or if there is something written about it, like a statement, or if you go in a gallery and there's something written, so you can get some context. And we'll look at some examples during the lecture of how the context of an image can change the way we might look at an image. Okay, so let's start by talking about the parts of a photograph. So we're going to I'd like to break things down as simply as possible. So I think that there's three sort of main elements to a photograph. It's the subject, the form, and the content. So let's break each of these apart. The subject is simply, as you can imagine, what is the main subject of the photograph? What is it a picture of? The form is all the visual elements of the photograph. Okay, anything visual. We're going to break all these down even more. And then the content would be the story, the symbolism, the idea, the meaning, if there is any of that, and if we can know what any of that is. So these are really the main parts. And I think when you're learning to critique images or talk about images, I like to break it down. So if you can, it's going to happen at some point where an image is going to come up and you're going to want to talk about it, and you're going to go, you're speechless. And speechless can happen because it's so wonderful, or it can happen because it's not so wonderful, right? So you kind of have to have these things to fall back on. You can always start to talk about the subject and the form, okay? So as an example, this is a photograph of mine from the Outer Banks of North Carolina, one of my favorite places. We could say the subject is a house on a sand dune. We could also say the subject is a house at the beach or at the ocean, if you could see that it's at the beach or the ocean. The form would be, it's a blue house. It's a pretty desaturated image. It's using a pretty broad depth of field. It's using negative space and composition, right? Because the house is tucked down in the corner and there's lots of negative space. So already I've talked about some technical aspects like the aperture. We've talked about the color of the house. We've talked about the saturation. We've talked about the composition. Okay, so those are all formal aspects. We could also say it's sort of monochromatic, right? It doesn't have a lot of variety in colors in it. Okay. And then the meaning may or may not be evident, but maybe I give you some backstory and you understand, or maybe it's called Grandfather's Cottage, okay, or some title that gives you some sense that this is a beach house. It's been in the family a long time. This was my grandfather's. This is where we spent holidays. I'm making all this up. Not really. I wish I had a house at the Outer Banks. But meaning, so it could be the story around it if you have that information. Okay, so this is just an example of subject, form, content. Okay. Okay, so let's start with talking about the subject a little more. So is the subject clear? Is it obscured? Right? Because the subject isn't always apparent. We're going to look at some examples. When we think of abstract images, then sometimes we don't know what the subject is. It's not identifiable, okay? And we'll talk about how to talk about abstract images. But this is something that I've been saying for a really long time, that when I'm teaching visual design or when I'm teaching any students about the visual side of photography, I think it's really important to create hierarchy in your image. And if you've watched any of my visual design or composition videos or taken any of my classes, I talk about this a lot. Okay, so imagine when you go to a play. There's never any doubt of who the leading actor is, right? It's not like, who's the star of the show? Okay, so there's the star, the leading role, And then there's all the supporting cast. And the supporting cast is there to support the actor, okay? Or think of the Tour de France, the lead rider in the peloton, right? The other riders on the team do not try to win the races. They support the lead rider in the bicycling race so that he will win the race most often, okay? I think a photograph should be the same way. Your subject should be the leading role, and everything that's included in the frame should be supporting the leading role. If the subject is not the leading role, well, something has gone amiss, right? If the viewer doesn't know what the subject is, and I don't mean an abstract image, that's a little different, we'll talk about that. But I mean, if you come to an image and you don't immediately know what the subject is, it can leave confusion, or the viewer is suddenly not invited into the image because it's like, well, I don't even know what this is about. Or there's so much in the frame that I don't know what was most important. I don't know what the photographer wanted me to look at. So it's really important as the photographer to identify what is your subject. And that sounds simple, but ask yourself how many times when you're actually shooting are you asking yourself that question? What is my subject? And when you answer that question, it's important to get specific, okay? Meaning it's not just, well, it's that landscape, right? It's more specific. Maybe it's the light falling on the leaves on that tree in that landscape, okay? So if you can get specific with why are you making this picture? What drew you to make this picture? Then you can begin to make decisions, whether that's technical or visual, to highlight what the subject is. Okay, so everything in the frame, I believe, should support the subject, and if there's anything in the frame that doesn't support the subject or detracts from the subject, it either needs to be removed or minimized by technical choice, by composition, perspective, or sometimes post-processing, right? So the subject generally is the leading star, the lead actor, okay? So when we're critiquing work, it's important, I think, to be able to identify the subject most often. I also want to say as a little caveat, there's no hard, fast rules in photography. I'm a big fan of, I think there's a lot of gray area in photography, meaning I won't often say you should always or you should never do this or that, okay? So that's why I'm saying things like generally. Are there elements in the scene that are detracting from the subject? Okay, if there are, it's important to identify them, talk about them, and talk about how to remove them, improve them. So I'll use images in my lecture, just so you know. Any of my lectures, I use images of mine. I use a lot of images from photo history, because I think there's so many fantastic ones. I use images from contemporary photographers, colleagues. So I will always try, most often, to say who the photographer is, but if not, you can certainly ask me. This is Harry Callahan, and we'll talk about him in the Creative Muse class. This is his wife, Eleanor. So here's an example of the subject being very clear, right? There's no question the subject is the woman. She's staring at the camera, she's sharp, she's large in the frame, right? And the background is out of focus, it's in the background. So I don't think there is anything distracting from her. Okay, I'm being very brave in this lecture, and I'm showing a lot of my images that didn't work. It's really fun as a teacher to be able to show all your best images, but I need to use images as examples, and I didn't want to use my students' images as what's not working and embarrass them publicly, so I'll use my own. So this is like the Montana State Fair, really fun, festival in the summer, and I saw this is a giant wall with this wall mural on it. I thought it was really funny, and I asked my friend to get down below and dance. And so I took a bunch of pictures of her dancing. But I think that this is a situation where the subject it's not really working. I didn't really convey that, okay? Because I wanted the subject to be her dancing and her sort of being goofy and interacting in front of this mural. But there's some choices that I made that I think are not communicating that. One, she's very small in the frame. Two, she's blurred. Three, she's wearing muted clothing, right? And then the mural behind her is everything that she's not. It's big, it's bold, it's bright, it's sharp, right? So I think this is an example where it had potential, it was kind of fun, but I don't think the subject or my idea really came through. Would you all probably agree with what I said there? So I wanted this interaction of her and the funny scene of her underneath these hilarious dancers. So yeah, but I think we can always say, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that, right? We shoot fast, we shoot quick, we shoot with our intuition. And as you all know, I mean, so many of our images don't work, right? The key is being discerning in when we decide which images get through to the other side to show, right? You have to be discerning there and say, okay, this one didn't work. So no one has seen this image. Well, now the world has, apparently. So it doesn't work. Yeah, the world meaning whoever's going to watch the video on YouTube and everybody in the room. Here's another picture that I don't think works. You guys are going to look at this lecture and be like, God, she's an awful photographer. I have some of my good stuff in here, too. It takes courage to show your images that don't work. But so I'm using this as an example because that idea of what was my subject. Okay, I'm telling you, what I was drawn to was this beautiful light falling on that tree, the shape of the tree, and then the blown out highlights. It's like summer. It says summer to me, right? Summer, bright light. You can tell, I think you can tell I'm looking through a kitchen window. So, you know, I don't think this image worked because I did not make what I was drawn to very important in the frame. There's a lot of other things distracting from it, okay? I think the window frame itself, I forgot that my pointer doesn't really show up on the TV. So the window frame itself is distracting. The light above the window is distracting. Actually, this reflection of what's happening inside, the dress I'm wearing or whatever, is distracting, okay? So again, this image didn't work because I did not remove all the elements of the frame that were distracting. Now in post-processing, if I really wanted to save these images, I would probably crop in the top. I would probably do some processing. I would try to minimize this. I would try to bring this out, okay? But I've decided that this isn't an image worth saving, okay? And this is my funny slide of this is how to be a landscape photographer in Montana, right? Make sure you include the big sky. Make sure you include some wild animals. Wild animals. This is my friend, and I was just making fun of her. Like, really? You're taking that picture? Okay. So, but it's very clear what her subject is. It's the cow. It's the big sky. Yeah, shooting through the barbed wire. Okay. My unnamed friend that I won't say. Okay, so the way that you can support the subject, or all the ways that we can communicate what the subject is in our images, and when we're talking and critiquing about images, all the things we need to consider is, okay, well, the composition's a big one, right? The way you compose that frame will determine how important the subject is, okay? Our technical decisions, right? Our aperture, our depth of field, our shutter speed, our lens choice, our focal length, right? All those choices when we're shooting in the field will determine if the subject is the lead actor or not. And again, things that we need to focus on when we're talking about photographs. Perspective, okay? Again, lens choice, are you using a wide angle and putting the subject large in frame? Are you using a shallow depth of field and a long lens? Where is the photographer standing? Okay, if you're shooting a little dandelion, are you getting down on the ground close to the dandelion? Okay. So your position where the photographer stands will also determine the importance of the subject in the frame. And then, of course, post-processing is a big one, right? There's a lot we can do in post-processing. Now, does that mean we spend all of our time in front of the computer trying to save bad images? Please no, please. However, I do think post-processing is a very important part of what we do. And I know that everybody lies on a spectrum of how much processing they like to do. And everybody would like to say that Ansel Adams would not, use Photoshop, which is so false. He would be a Photoshop master, okay? He would be manipulating his images highly in Photoshop because that's what he did in the darkroom, right? So in post-processing, there's ways that we can support the subject by minimizing other elements, okay? Whether that's cropping an element out or darkening something and lightening the subject, okay, desaturating things. There's lots of ways we can do that. We'll look at some examples later. So let's look at an example of an image that I feel that as I took it, didn't really work, but this is what I ended up with that I think is a much better image. Okay, so this is in Sedona. So let me kind of walk you through how this happened. I saw the scene. I took quite a few shots. I mean, not a ton. I'm not a rapid fire shooter. I grew up in the days of film, medium format. So, yeah, 20, 30 images is a lot. I don't take hundreds. So, this image I probably took 20 shots of in different ways. And, I was drawn to the prayer flags against the blue sky, but I also wanted the inclusion of the rocks because it gives a sense of place. It's Sedona, and they're so known for those rocks, and so I wanted those included. So I think that here, would you agree that maybe there's a little confusion as to what I was wanting to bring your eye to? I mean, the scene in general, but the rock's important, the blue sky is alluring, the flags. Okay, so this is what I did in processing. So I cropped it to square. I straightened the horizon a little more. And I did that not necessarily to like straighten the horizon, but I did that to create more of this very strong diagonal between the rock and the prayer flags. So they're sort of mimicking each other. What else did I do in processing? I desaturated the sky, right? Because blue skies, as is green grass, are very alluring. So if green grass or blue skies aren't your main subject, I often will desaturate and minimize them, okay? Because unless you saw this image first, which you all did, but if you came to this image first, you wouldn't know what that sky looked like before I gave you this example, okay? So you might be sitting here going, well, I like the sky blue. Well, that's my job as a photographer to decide what I want it to look like, okay? I also brightened the flags a little bit. I saturated the flags just a touch. I also, as you can see, slightly desaturated the red rocks, slightly. That's about all I did, okay? But I think that this makes it a little more clear. In my eyes, I think the flags become most important, and then the sky and the rocks feel like a setting for the flags, okay? So we make all sorts of choices, right? Here, what technical tool did I use here to draw your attention to the subject? Right, shallow depth of field, very shallow depth of field, right? What else is drawing your eyes to the subject? Color, right. So that blue chair in the background could have been distracting. I threw it out of focus. I actually desaturated it just slightly. And then, there's beautiful light on the cherry tomatoes as well, which we can always use light, right? Photographers, we can forget sometimes that it is our medium. Painters use paint, dancers use their body, writers use words, we use light. Oh. I know, my dog. So what choices did I make here? First of all, is there any question what the subject is? No. Okay. What choices did I make here to really highlight the subject and not create any question? Yeah, that's one of the big ones here. I got down on his level, right? I'm not shooting from above. So, we're connecting on this level with the dog, right? And then he's sort of looking off, and it sort of makes us curious of like, well, he just also looks like he's just basking in the sun on a winter day, right? Compositionally, I was very aware of where this, not so beautiful dead plant was to his head. I sort of framed it around him because I took a couple shots at first and then saw that, protruding from his ear, and I was like, I don't like that. So I made sure it sort of kind of just curved around his ear. I placed him off to the side slightly, and then there's a fun red ball, which adds that element of, play, but also draws attention to him, right? Okay, but the point is the things that notice there's also, we can't always do this, but there's catch light in the eyes, right? When we shoot living figures, it's really good to have catch light in the eyes because if we don't, then their eyes look dead, right? So, and luckily he was looking towards the light, so, I wasn't like, move to the left, dog, but again, there was nothing really, I don't think, in the frame that is distracting from him. Okay, what about this? What were some choices here? This is another image of mine. Well, I definitely wanted the dress to be, there's a connection between the dress and the girl because they're the only two things in the frame. But by putting the girl off the edge of the frame, I sort of made her secondary, okay? If I would have included her face and head in the frame, we connect with human faces as soon as we see them. She would have been the star like that. So by eliminating her face, I think it hopefully draws more attention to the dress. Notice I also desaturated the rest of the scene and I actually saturated the dress. Okay, I mean that red brick wall was more red, the red dress, everything. So, and then I wanted there hopefully to be this sort of back and forth connection or question between the girl and the dress, the girl and the dress. And this is just a series, it's actually self-portrait. It's a series of photographs that I did on the idea of play and getting older and youth. You know, hence the pigtail as well, the braid. Notice also some compositional choices. Notice, you know, how the dress is floating in that window frame, not being blocked by any of the window frame, okay? Also notice how I was pretty careful to have the horizontal lines of the bricks line up with the horizontal edge of my frame, so there's not a lot of skewing happening. I have some very strong verticals and horizontals, okay? Okay, so we know with that photograph is broken down into subject, form, and content. Okay, we just talked a lot about the subject. So let's talk about form. I mean, form is a big one when we're critiquing and talking about images, because it's all the visual stuff, right? So first we're going to talk about the visual aspects of form, and then we're going to talk about the technical aspects of form. So the basic building blocks for all photographs is line, shape, texture, and color. Those are our formal elements of a photograph. Line, shape, texture, and color. So these are always things that you can talk about if you're at a loss for words, or if you're not, things that we can identify in a photograph when we're talking about it, okay? So this photograph of line, shape, texture, and color, yeah, I'd say color is a probably pretty primary one here. I'd say color first, and then shape and texture feel kind of important as well. Yeah. And we have complementary colors, right? Opposite each other on the color wheel. Yellow and blue, right? Here's a historical photograph. This is Edward Weston. Shape and texture, I would say. I think the texture is very important, and shape for sure. I think the shapes are really important here. This was at a hot springs. I saw my friend standing in front of these weird plastic things hanging. Texture was a big one too, because of the way the light was coming through these sort of plastic sheets hanging there was pretty important to me too. But her shape and the repeating all the squares, you know, sort of rectangles, and then the light coming through and revealing texture were pretty big. There was not a lot of color in the scene. Yep, so shape and texture. This is in the San Juan Islands. I used to do a workshop there. I think I can say, because I'm the photographer, that the color drew me immediately. That was the first thing that I saw, was these lush greens, and then the old trailer was like kind of this rusted, faded orange greenish. So that was the first thing that drew me. And then of course the textures of this lush grass against this old, you know, rotting metal hunk just sitting there. Then when I composed the scene, I really paid attention to the arrangement of the shapes. That was important, okay? Color is a big one, right? And we have to, when we talk about photographs, and I'm not gonna get into color theory here, I do, actually B&H has one of my visual design lectures up, and I do get into color theory, but color, of course, as we know, has a lot of impact on the way we see images. Imagine if this were blue or red or white, how different it would feel from the gold, okay? So that's an important thing to talk about when we talk about images, is that impact, the emotional impact of color, okay? But yeah, I'd say color is a big one here. This is my friend Elizabeth Stone's image. This is a photograph of mine as well. I was really drawn to a lot of the repeating lines, all those really strong horizontal lines. And the color is something I added in post-processing. Okay, you can imagine it wasn't this sort of neon looking. And I did this to mimic cross-processing in film. When we used to cross-process film and you get those funky colors, when you take film and process it in the wrong chemicals. So I tweaked to the colors in this one in processing to kind of throw it out of reality a little bit with the really prominent reds and greens and yellows. But I prefer to have a little bit of mystery in images, quite a bit. And so for me, this was my friend and I, and we were, dressed up and photographing each other, and but it was the scene of the motel itself that was so intriguing to me, and I just wanted some human element, but I also liked that it looked like she was rushing. She's got her bags, she's blurred, she's sort of running out of the frame, or she's at the edge of the frame, and I think that creates tension. Well, I know that when someone's at the edge of the frame, it creates tension. And also when I think of motels, no vacancy, I think of travel, movement, and I kind of wanted to add to that feeling of, again, movement, travel, her sort of looking like she's rushing or, not relaxing in the scene. Is it creating depth? Okay, because often, and not in all of our photographs, but often we want to create a foreground, midground, background, if that's what you want to do in your images visually. And I would agree that this would feel like a very flat plane, but she does add this other element of depth to it. The subject is a little more conceptual, it's not obvious, and that's true. And this would be something where context is important, because this is one of a series of photographs about this girl at this hotel. So there's more of a story when you see the other images, and you're absolutely right. I had the idea and the concept and then made the images based on the idea. Yep. But we can't always see the series, we can't always know the concept, right? So another image that I sort of had the concept for it and was photographing my friend in this old abandoned building, okay? So I think it was very much about the texture here for me and just the scene in general. You can see elements that I included, like the unplugged refrigerator, the line of the cord. The place looks kind of empty. She looks like she's got her sort of cleaning clothes on with her apron. So I then, as you can imagine, processed it once again with this sort of bluish greenish cast, okay, to sort of add to that feeling of, emptiness. It was an empty place. And so imagine how different this would feel if it was, warm, golden light, right? So again, I processed it to change the mood of the photograph. And my point of this is, if you're critiquing images and the processing is as obvious as this, it needs to be talked about, right? It's very obvious that this isn't how the scene actually looked. I think most of you would know, right, that is not how we see the world in this sort of neon cross-process color. So that's something when you're giving feedback on images that would be important to address. Is it working? Is it not working? What kind of mood is it creating? So I think processing is important to talk about when it's obviously processed. Again, remember, critiques are subjective. Yeah. So we're talking, the point of this class is more to talk about what we can talk about when we look at photographs. Okay? And then it's always important to make a suggestion of why you feel like something could be different or changed. Okay? So some other formal aspects that we can talk about are all the technical choices that we use that change the visual look of our image. Aperture, shutter speed, focus, exposure, all those things, right? Those baseline things that we learned as new photographers and we still use constantly, right? So for instance, the choice to use a very shallow depth of field versus a large depth of field. The choice of shutter speed to use with moving objects, okay? These are all things that we can talk about when we talk about images. Again, shutter speed choices, but then also look at the difference in exposure in these. This is the same image, just exposed very differently. This is my friend Elizabeth Stone, she's my teaching partner. Look how different the image feels, this one versus the light one, right? The other one has like this light, airy sense of possibility, and this one feels very foreboding to me. Look how much detail also is seen in the birds here versus that one. Okay, so choice of exposure, whether that's in camera or in processing later, can really change the mood of the photograph. This is the contemporary photographer Uta Barth, okay, who specializes a lot in soft focus images. Okay, so she purposely, meaning, this is where context matters. If you were talking to Uta Barth and you were like, it's out of focus, it should be sharp, it would be like, quiet, sit down. Because this is what she does, right? Everything she makes, almost everything she makes is purposely thrown out of focus. It's also important to know, so maybe you might say, well, I didn't know that about Uta Barth, However, I think when you look at this image, this is not a focus problem. You know what I mean? And this is why, when I teach my students, I say, if you're gonna do something, do it intentionally. Really do it. If you just slightly throw it out of focus, it looks like a mistake. It looks like you didn't focus your camera, or your lens didn't focus, your autofocus didn't work. So if you want to do soft focus, you have to really throw it out of focus to make it look very intentional and purposeful, okay? So I think you could, in other words, if we were talking about this image, I don't think we would say, well, your focus is totally off. No, I think we would probably understand the photographer did that on purpose, and then it would be very much about the shapes and the color in the frame. And again, it's not about if you like it or don't like it, okay? When we need to talk about images. Irving Penn, one of the greatest studio photographers who ever lived, right? Okay, so a photographer like Uta Barth who chooses to use very soft focus, and then Irving Penn, look at the insane detail in this image, right? I mean, the choices he made here, the black and white, the really, really beautiful detail, the choice though to have no detail or light outside of her face. That looks like a very purposeful choice. So again, this is probably not an image where we would say, well, there's no detail in your blacks, right? I think we can tell. I mean, maybe we didn't know it's Irving. If we knew it was Irving Penn, we of course know it's on purpose. But this is where we could talk about things like the beautiful light, the texture that's being revealed because it is in black and white. And the beautiful, excellent sharp focus, right? And that choice of not having any detail in the hair just draws us in to the face, right? Yeah, the beautiful eyes. So Sugimoto, my all-time favorite photographer. Let me just go on record by saying that. Sugimoto, if you'd ever like to meet me, I'd love to meet you. Like he's watching my B&H lecture. He has studios in Paris, Tokyo, and New York. I think he's busy doing something else. But he's Japanese, just really interesting photographer. And some of you might know his work. He's in shows in New York quite a bit. And this is a project that he did many years ago called Seascapes. So he went around the world and photographed different seas around the world. And what's really cool about that project is, he talks that he doesn't just go and snap shots. He will go and stay at the place for months and just sort of live with it. But my point of showing this here is we're talking about, the technical choices we make. So here's an example where he's allowed the ocean to go really out of focus, okay? Probably using a very long exposure so that ebb and flow of the water is blurring that horizon. Here's another that he shot where he chose to have a little more detail from his choice of shutter speed. And then here's another one where it's somewhere in between, okay? This is also an example where, especially if you see 3 of his images, I think Sugimoto probably knows about the rule of not putting the horizon in the middle of the frame. I mean, in other words, I think that's a creative choice he's making. I don't think we would say to Sugimoto here, well, I think if you brought it up in the upper third or lower third, you'd create more visual interest. I think he's definitely, and he doesn't do this with all of his seascapes, but he's creating this feeling of symmetry and balance by doing that. Now, if that horizon were off kilter, that would be something to address. Okay, because if we want a horizon off kilter, again, we got to throw it off kilter. If it's just slightly off kilter, it looks like a mistake. Okay, so the last thing is content. And we're going to look at lots of examples, and then we're going to critique images together. So content, this is the other part that we can talk about. And I left this one for last because this can often be the harder part of talking about photographs, right? What is the story? What is the implied meaning? Is there a symbol or metaphor? There may be, there may not be. But if there's one that's obvious, it's kind of important to address. And we'll look at examples. Is the meaning apparent or hidden? Documentary photographs, the story is usually very prevalent, right? photojournalism, usually pretty prevalent. Does it evoke a mood, a memory, emotion? And this is where it gets subjective, right? Every single one of us in a room perhaps might get a different mood or memory or emotion from a photograph. Or everyone in the room might get the same one, depending on how clear that, that communication is, right? But these are all important things to talk about when we talk about the content. Okay, I mean, the content of this photograph is the first thing that I think you probably see, okay? And this is my point as well, is subject, form, content, there's no order of which you talk about first, what's most important. It's basically what hits you first. And in this image, you're not gonna probably start talking about all the use of all the vertical lines first, right? You're gonna look at it and be like, wow, what a catch. What an interesting story. This is in South Africa during apartheid. This is Jürgen Schadberg is his name. He's a South African photographer. So the story is the first thing that hits you. And I'm not saying that then you wouldn't go and talk about the vertical lines, the use of these repetitive lines, okay, but probably not the first thing, right? The sense of tension here, I mean, that the mood, everything that's evoked in this, I think is pretty important. Those would be the first things that I would talk about. So again, an image of mine, is the meaning immediately obvious? Maybe, maybe not. Resurrection, life, seasons, optimism, Mother Nature. I mean, you're hitting them all. I mean, this is deep in the winter. This is like March and winter in Montana. We have long winters there, and also I like the mention of optimism as well, because I was having a really just tough week, tough day, and I was out and my friend drugged me out for a photo shoot, and I just grabbed some props, and one of the props I grabbed was this little fern. And it was about hope and optimism and spring and what's coming and growth in a otherwise desolate environment. It's about all those things you're talking about, right? So again, this story might not be as obvious as this story, but I think that that's where the symbolism or meaning should probably be important to talk about and is different for everybody in the room, or not. Edward Steichen, great historical photographer. Right? So we're talking about content, right? I mean, I think texture is something you would talk about probably immediately when you saw this. But what other content or stories or symbols comes up when you see this image? Facial expression, for sure, would be important to address. Emotion, right? And then identifying what those emotions are. Like, what would you say? She looks angry, okay? Demonic is a word. Okay, so someone in mourning, there's a symbol that comes up for someone else, is the black veil and what that symbolizes. Very mysterious, I would agree. I mean, when our faces are covered or a face is covered in an image, I do think that there's a removal from us and the person, even though she's looking right at us. And again, the facial expression. So all those things would be really important to talk about with this image if we were talking to Edward and he were in the room. Surprise, I love that. Uncertainty, holiday, winter, for sure, winter, yep. And I think it would be important to talk about that shot of red in the otherwise black and white landscape is pretty intentional. Sort of Asian looking, curiosity, isolation. You guys are great, you don't even need this class. So yeah, this is an image of mine, and it has to do with all those things you were talking about. A lot of them are resonating. It was also for me that idea of kind of hanging on. It's actually late fall, and that apple is just, I mean, you can tell it's rotted, it's encased in ice, and it's just still hanging on. And it's probably the last one on the tree, and it's going down at some point. So yeah, it was that sort of, surprise, I liked that element. Did you say surprise was the word? I liked that word, finding it first of all, but then that sort of, like I said, that kind of hanging on the inevitability of that it was going to drop and winter's coming, right? Not everybody has to know that it's actually an apple. Okay, so an example where the subject maybe isn't the most important thing to talk about here, but I think the symbolism, the metaphor is something that maybe came forward more, or that you could talk about. Can you tell what the subject matter immediately of this image is? You know, people said, oh, well, the banner or the lights, but then someone said it's a party, right? So the subject matter really is the event, right? So yeah, it is probably a celebration of some sort. Would everybody agree that it feels like a celebration of some sort, right? Now, the banner is in another language that we may or may not know, but can we deduce? I mean, we've already told that it's a celebration.
Welcome.
It says welcome, yes. Is it welcoming? Okay. So, you know, just an example again of the feeling and emotion and mood of it. I hope that it's welcoming to you. I hope that the lights and the sign and the open door and the warmth of it would make you want to step in. No, someone's going no. And maybe not everybody in the room, it does. Again, that's why it's subjective. And you might ask, well, I mean, this is the wedding I shot, but why, you know, back in the day, why did I not just step in and take the shot? Well, I'm sure I did that too, because I'm shooting a wedding, so I shot a lot of them. But one, I wanted the welcome sign, and two, I wanted the rustic wood doorway to kind of give a sense of place, of what this place was like. Okay, so if we look at, if you look at like academic how-to critiques, okay, often this is a sort of list of what is on the academic how-to critique, meaning it's important to describe, and this isn't just for photography, I looked this up for like anything, okay, so to describe, to analyze, to interpret, and then to evaluate, okay? But again, I like to kind of break things down in a simpler way, so when I look at these, I think it comes down to what do you see, what does it feel like, and then what do you think about it? Okay, it's kind of that subject, form, content. What do you see, what do you feel, and what do you think? Okay, so when we talk about what we see, I mean, this is pretty much what we've been talking about for the last hour. We need to talk about sometimes the technical things. We might talk about the sharpness. We might talk about the exposure, the white balance, the subject itself, the depth of field. Okay? We might talk about these because they're off. We might not talk about them at all because maybe some of the images that came up, the concept or story was so, you know, potent that you're not going to be talking about the use of shallow depth of field. Or the other thing is if these are all good, meaning they're not mistakes, then often we might not go there and talk about them, meaning we're probably not going to bring up white balance if white balance looks good. But we are going to talk about it if it looks off, right? We're probably not going to talk about exposure if the exposure is good, okay? And I don't mean, notice I don't say if it's right, because there's no right or wrong for exposure. You can choose to over underexpose, that's your creative choice, okay? However, if your highlights are blown out and it's distracting from your subject or it's problematic in the frame, then you might talk about that, okay? So these are things we can talk about. We can also talk about the formal aspects, line shapes, textures, and colors if they seem important or prominent in the picture. We can also talk about the composition, the perspective, where the photographer stood, and the lens choice. And then what the gentleman in the back pointed out is presentation when it gets to that point, if we're looking at not just a digital file on a screen, but a print on a wall. Presentation's really important. I would venture to say that photographers, we are probably the ones who drop the ball the most on presentation of any collection of artists on the planet. Meaning, you know, when dancers go to their production, they're not thinking about the costumes. And when painters hang their paintings, they're thinking about the edges and at what level they're hung at and the scale of their painting. They're considering that before they even start the scale, right? So I think that we often, and especially more so in the digital age where we don't print and present as much, So kudos to all of you who are doing that and having portfolio reviews and making prints. And, you know, presentation's really important, and it's a very powerful tool. Scale and installation and how things are framed and shown are really important that can help communicate an idea, or they can help kill an idea. I've seen many presentations of my students' work in their final where it was like, I mean, luckily I would work with them through, so it was never a surprise at the end. But, you know, I've definitely seen presentations where the presentation harmed the overall message, idea, or visual of the project itself. It wasn't in harmony with it, or it was, choices were made because the student just thought it was cool, you know, and it didn't actually help communicate the idea. Or sometimes the presentation can be distracting. You know, if you're using elements that aren't supporting the subject. What do you feel when you look at the image, okay? The mood, the emotion, is it evoking at every other senses? One of the assignments that I would give my students in the visual studies program at Rocky Mountain School of Photography, it was the first assignment I gave them because I kind of wanted them to freak out a little bit. And I would have them photograph a sense other than sight. And I would say, I want to smell it, I want to taste it, I want to feel it, or I want to hear it. Okay, so is there another sensory, you know, sometimes when you look at an image, you can almost feel what it would feel like, or you could smell it. Imagine a picture of, you know, popcorn, whatever, okay? Does it evoke a memory, an association? Is there a reaction that happens? Those would be important to talk about. And then, of course, I'm kind of summarizing what we've talked about in the last hour, just bringing it to the see, feel, think. What do you think? Is there a story? Is there a message? Is the photographer communicating something? Is there an idea, a metaphor, a symbol? There may or may not be. But if there's a prevalent one, then it's important to talk about. So what I'm essentially saying is what you are seeing and feeling helping to support an idea, story, or message? If these are incongruent, then something's gone awry, okay? And we've all been there before, whether it's our own images or someone else's. I mean, it's happened a million times with students where we have a critique and there's all this feedback and the student's like, well, you guys are all off base. That's totally not what I meant by this photograph. And that's where I would say, okay, critiques are subjective, but if 20 people in the room are getting the same message and that message is off base, then you got to listen to that, right? Or if 20 people say that choice of presentation, that choice of processing, that lens choice, whatever, isn't working, versus one person saying that, I think then we have to kind of listen. So, you know, if what you're seeing and feeling is completely in left field from what the photographer intended, if the photographer is there to talk to about it, then you need to start to do that, you know, brainstorming and helping of, okay, what went wrong here? Why are we all feeling this when you wanted us to feel this? Or why did none of us get the metaphor or symbol that you were going for? What choices did you make that took us off base? Or what choices can you make to bring us closer to what you're trying to communicate, okay? This is why, you know, I think critiquing is a very important skill, and I think that you take a lot of responsibility in your hands when you choose to critique someone else's work. And if you're not interested in giving constructive criticism, then don't do it. And your responsibility is to then guide that person and help them understand what you're getting from the image and help them perhaps move to a better place with it. And I say this because not everybody is meant to critique, and not all people are good at critique. And I've certainly been in this situation. I got a Master of Fine Arts in grad school, trust me, I've been there, right? If anybody's been in art grad school, you've had the critique where they just go squash. What good is that? What does that do, right? That's just as good as the critique that everybody just goes, bravo, great job, it's beautiful. What is that? That doesn't do anything for me. Why is it beautiful? Why bravo? What's working, what's not working, right? I mean, if I've had clients contact me, former students, who were ready to clients contact me, former students, who were ready to, I had one who took down his website and was ready to quit photography. And he was a fantastic photographer because he sought out a local photographer that he respected and admired in his town to give him feedback. And the guy obviously was jealous and threatened by him, was my deduction. And he totally annihilated the kid, annihilated him. And the kid was about to quit. And I said to him, first of all, that was one person's perspective. He was competition in your town, or you're competition to him. And if someone just annihilates you, that's not a critique. It's hard to hear. I mean, we hold on to it, but you got to go get some more feedback, right? So again, it's important to help, when we give feedback, to help the people understand what's working and what's not working in our own humble opinions. Okay, so did the visual technical choices the photographer make help to support a subject and communicate something? Okay, so let's start looking at some images and asking this question, okay, and thinking of our see, feel, think. And I'm not throwing you the most straightforward images all the time, right? So ask yourself this question, right? And this question. What words come to mind when you look at this photograph? And I got nerves of steel, so don't worry, I'm not going to get offended by 3/4, 1/4, okay? Wet. Random. What is it? So, okay, so some people get stuck on if they don't know what it is, you can have a hard time talking about it. But remember, if you don't know what it is, you can always fall back on all the visual. What are you seeing visually, or what are you feeling? And if you're not feeling anything, and then you don't know what it is, well, then you're left with talking about the visual aspects. Some people might immediately feel something, wet, right, or something else, and then other people are just going, I don't even know what to say. That's where you go to the visual aspects. What other words come to mind when you look at this image?
Incongruous.
Incongruous? Confusing? Okay. And for you, it evoked a feeling of being on a train and looking out the window. It feels sorrowful, and someone else in the room might be going, I don't get that, but that's good for you to say. It feels sorrowful. It feels like something's being pulled away because of the image on the right. And it's good to identify why it feels like something's being pulled away, and you said because of the image on the right. Okay, and I think perhaps maybe it's because the image on the right is out of focus and there's a sense of distance. Okay, so it's good to kind of keep going with those thoughts of why, what choices were made that makes it feel that way. It feels optimistic. You use the word hopeful, spring. So let's go a little further with that. Why do you get the sense of, what elements there are giving you the sense of spring, for instance? Yep, the green and the raindrops. The person's also wearing white, which could give that feeling of hopefulness, perhaps. Does it work? Exactly. So I can tell you what my thought process was around it. One person hit on it, which was spring and hope. However, from my perspective, the fact that, and also there's people sitting in the room who aren't talking, of course, so it could be that half the room felt spring and hope, and I'm just not getting that. I mean, if we're in a critique where the people critiquing are all talking, which we're not doing here, and that's fine, then I'd get more feedback from the panel, in other words. However, if I were in a portfolio review and I'd be hearing from all these people, when the first words I hear are things like incongruent, random, confusing, that's important for me to hear, right? That's important for me to go, okay, there's an incongruence between the images. It left people feeling confused, and then there was, a person who sort of picked up on the raindrops and the color and all of that. So is it working or not? In my opinion, even though it's my image and I like it, and there's also that element for all of us that you were just like, I don't really care. I don't think that my perception of this image was communicated clearly, because that's not the feedback that I got from the majority of the people. So if I were really trying to communicate what the one person got, then I would have to make some other decisions along the way, okay? However, because all of our images are our own and it's up to us what we want our images to do and say. I didn't need this image to clearly communicate spring and hope to everyone. Like, to me, it's just kind of pretty, and it means those things to me, but I'm fine that it means other things to other people, okay? But if I were really trying to communicate spring and hope, I would have to make some other choices along the way, because that's not what I got from the crowd. And if you're just wondering what it is, I shot rain through a window. So this is the photograph. The entire photograph was green grass through a rainy window, and then I composited this image into it, which is a self-portrait of me thrown out of focus. So I work a lot with compositing and diptychs, and I was kind of playing with the figure so yeah. Now also keep in mind, this is not a critique setting, meaning one person would never be in a room with 50 people, 50 random New Yorkers, thank God, getting feedback. Like, that's not how it works, right? You go to a portfolio review and you talk to 5 or 6 people, or you get critiqued from one other person, or a team of professors that are 5 people, but I mean, I also understand when you go to camera clubs, you might be in that situation where a large group of people are talking to you about your work, okay? But, you know, we have to be a little, like, practical about, well, and that brings up a good point is, you know, be careful about who you seek out feedback from, right? Okay, your mom's always gonna love your work, and so is your wife and husband, probably, unless they're in critical, which is great, but not overly critical, right? So, you know, it's good to seek out feedback from people you respect, people who have a lot of experience at looking at a lot of images. I mean, I think that's why I can bring to the table, it's why I even put together the idea of a critique class. I mean, I'm no expert on critique, I'm subjective as well. However, I do have that one asset, I have an asset of having had my eyeballs on a lot of people's work over 15 years. Like, I've seen a lot of work. So there's a benefit to that, right? So it's important to seek out work or people that you know are capable of giving you good feedback. And perhaps in that group or camera club situation, I mean, you all know there's always those couple people where you just have to go like, la 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 la. Yeah, you're talking, but I'm not listening, because they just don't, maybe you just don't jive with each other's work, you know, or they just don't get your images, or they just don't like it, because we all have personal preferences as well, right? So, or maybe they just don't know how to give feedback in a constructive way, right? So I have a whole collection of images that I want us to look at. So I'm going to skip through some of these images. Let's critique this image. What are some thoughts? The lines. I mean, I think the story is the first 2 things that came out of people's mouth is the story, besides someone saying the lines. And then I like that you pointed out some of the visual things of the arms crossed tells a certain story. The ball, several people have talked about the waiting for the owner to play. I mean, it's not a new shiny bright green tennis ball. That thing's been through some fetch, right? I mean, it's old, it's peeling, it's dirty. There's the bright sun, there's the fresh green grass, there's the old ball, and then I think potentially an old dog because of the white paws, but that wouldn't necessarily have to be. This is my image, so I know it's an old dog. I do want to make a comment, since this is my image, is I actually ended up going back in and cloning that out because I found it distracting.
Yeah.
So if I were critiquing this image, I think I would bring that up because, first of all, 3 odd numbers, you know, it creates this rhythm and pattern. We're gonna follow that line. It mimics this round shape. It's it's up tucked into the corner. It's bright. It's white, and I don't think it adds anything to the story. So I actually went back in and cloned it out, and in reality, I should have just removed it from the scene as I was shooting, but I didn't see it, and then I cloned it out later because I found it taking away from the story. It was what a lot of people said. It was, I mean, it's a dog that fetches a whole bunch, right? You can tell he uses that ball a lot. We're taking a break because I'm like, stop, please, right? I can only fetch for so long. He's taking a break too in the sun. It's summer, we're having fun, and he's kicking back and relaxing and enjoying the sunshine while we're taking a break. So it was about play and summer and fun and fetch. I do want to talk about too, and I'm gonna go there in a second, but when we talk about diptychs or triptychs, multiple images used together, or when you look at photographs in a series, it's important to consider that, right? When two images are shown as diptychs, they're meant to be together and play off each other. So they kind of have to be talked about. They can be talked about separately, but ultimately they need to be talked about together, right? Everybody knows what I mean about a diptych, right? Two images shown together purposely. So go ahead, throw out some thoughts, okay? So contrast between the two images and the color makes you think of one out of many. Yes, I'm getting a lot of head nods on that. Yeah, I think the colors play off each other for sure. There's a lot of similar light grays, dark grays, earth tones in both of them. I think the color's pretty prominent. Okay, so the texture is very prominent for you. The water and wood, natural elements for sure. I mean, the word contrast has come up several times. That this one has a lot of horizontal movement and this one has a lot of vertical movement. Much about flow was what the comment was, that they're both about flow. I don't know if there's much more to say about this. I mean, I like what everybody said about it. I mean, it was, it's about nature. It was about that idea of one and many. I picked this one river rock and placed it and took a photograph of it because I thought it was so it looked like an egg. It was so perfectly shaped and smooth and beautiful. And so I took it and placed it on the wood downed tree and took a picture. And then as I was going through my images later, they were both from the same day, and I liked the idea of both of them together, of the one that was chosen out of the river. And also for me, it was just a memory of the day and the place and the time. And notice also the quality of light, just because we haven't been talking about light. So that's important to talk about in critiques as well. The light feels warm. Okay, so when we talk about light, and I do talk about this in the visual design course, we can talk about temperature, direction, quality, hard or soft. Okay, so it's important to talk about those. You can tell the light's pretty warm here. It looks like it's a sunny day. It's actually high contrast light here, but soft light here, right? Because here it has very hard shadows and hard specular highlights, and here there's no shadow. It feels very soft. So those are things we can talk about as well and critique, is the quality of light. I wanted to show this one as an example of, I think the choice between color and black and white potentially can tell slightly different stories. I think this one says wedding a lot more. And the reason I actually chose to make it black and white is, even though I think this can also say wedding, I also know it's a wedding, so I have that in my mind. So whether that said that to all of you, I'm not sure. But it's mostly because, I mean, I took the picture because of the expression of the dog that looks miserable in this stupid dress, right? No offense. No offense to people who dress up their dogs, but I mean, the dog looks miserable, right? I just thought it's so funny that this dog was like looking at me sideways. Its shoulders are humped. It's just like, are you kidding me? And I felt like, as you said, in this picture, it's very much about the blue, pretty dress and the color and the red collar, and I just didn't want any of that distraction. I wanted it to be about the funny expression on the dog's face. So something to talk about with black and white. When we talked about the formal aspects, the building blocks of an image are line, shape, texture, and color, keep in mind that when we remove color, line, shape, and texture become much more prominent, okay? So I do a whole workshop called Seeing in Black and White in Montana. And I mean, we talk about a lot of stuff, but that's one of the things we really focus on, is when we eliminate color, we need to really make sure that line, texture, shape are very important, right? So, we've talked about what we see, what we feel, what we think. We've talked about the subject and the content and the visual aspects, okay, the form, which also include the technical choices. Okay, we've talked about is what we're seeing and feeling, communicating an idea, okay? But as we've seen with some photographs, and I want to show you some examples, is sometimes there's one of those elements that's so outstanding it can't be ignored, right? Like emotion, okay? I mean, when I show you this next image, the emotion is the first thing that hits you, okay? So some images are just laden with emotion or reaction, okay? And that's important. We have to go with our gut when we give feedback and when we do critiques. You could not skip over the feeling of this image and begin to talk about line, shape, texture, and color. I mean, in a way, it's like doing a disservice to the image. It would be important to say, wow, it's very moving, or it's very sad, or it makes me angry, or whatever, okay? But it'd be really important to say, wow, you captured some really intense emotion here, okay? Emotion, I mean, right? I think that sometimes there's an outstanding element of all these things that we can talk about that might hit you first. And then just start with that, right? Start with that and then move to the other things, okay? To me, this emotion, it's, joy, connection, right? And then you can begin to talk about what else in the scene is causing that, right? Sometimes the technique hits you over the head, right? We've all seen this with over-the-top HDR, whether you like it or not, okay? When something is massively, I love that HDR is a verb now. When something is massively HDR'd, you can't not talk about that. You have to say, wow, the technique's really prominent, okay? The technique of using the scratching here and the soft focus, I think it's probably one of the first things you see. It's something that I don't think you could ignore in a critique, is talking about the use of texture here, okay? David Hockney, the British painter who did these combination of snapshots, basically, pictures, and put them into collages, okay? Again, the technique here can't be ignored. It's very prominent. You could not have this critique and not talk about, you wouldn't start talking about white balance immediately, right? Or focus or lens choice, right? And you'll see this in some critiques, the whole critique, you talk about the technique and you don't get to anything else because one element is just so hits you over the head, okay? When we talk about technique, as we all know, technique can add to the image or it can get in the way. And it's important, I think, to talk about that. If you feel that a technique gets in the way, again, soft focus images can work or not work. This is my image, so I have my own opinion. I think in this situation, the soft focus works. And this is the same subject, an ocean, where I think in this situation, the soft focus doesn't work. It's both a soft focus shot of the ocean, okay? That's just in my opinion. This one works, this one not so much. So it'd be important to talk about that and say why. Here's some other techniques that can get in the way, right? We've all seen it, and it's good to experiment with all this stuff, right? But sometimes it's hard to even talk about the subject, the form, or the content when the Photoshop filter is hitting you over the head, right? Or the crazy borders, or the HDR, or whatever. And that's where it'd be important to not knock it down because you don't like it. Like, wow, I hate over-the-top HDR, this is horrible. But you'd have to say to the photographer, or maybe you'd say to the photographer, wow, the use of that Photoshop filter is really strong. It's actually the first thing I see when I look at this image. The filter is actually even obscuring the form or content or subject for me. So if you can talk to the photographer personally, what was your reasoning for doing that? Why so heavy on the filter? And maybe they have a reason and they can tell you, right? So again, it's that intent. But if they're just like, I don't know, I liked it, then it would be like, okay, well, it's kind of getting in the way for me and this is why, right? Sometimes the story is the thing that is prominent, right? This is Edward Bertinsky, Canadian photographer who does these large-scale images about our impact on the environment. Okay, so again, probably wouldn't be talking about the repetitive circles here first, but would be talking about the meaning and the symbolism. Okay, again, story can be very strong. Yeah, this is that South African photographer again, Jürgen Schadberg. Jürgen. So sometimes the symbol can be really strong, okay? And it's important when there's really strong symbols, or I should say loaded symbols, loaded symbolism. We can't ignore it, right? But we also, I think, have to be very aware when there is a loaded symbol of what we bring to it in a critique, right? Obviously, there's a lot of loaded symbolism around this figure. And there's more loaded symbolism now than 5 years ago. And it could be different in 2 years, right? So, you know, when someone puts something in their image or has an image that's loaded with symbolism, again, it can't be ignored, but that's where I think you gotta navigate carefully. You know, another loaded symbol that's gonna have very different meaning for very different people in the room, right? So my point is just when there's heavily loaded symbolism, it needs to be talked about, but you know, we also have to really think about what we're bringing to it and what the photographer's intention was. When there's text in an image, text is very prominent, okay? When there's text in an image, signage text, we read it immediately. We can't ignore it. And it can also very much change the content of an image or the story of an image, okay? So that always has to be addressed. And also to just know that any text included in an image, it's the first place that we're gonna look because we read words, okay? So we have to assume when there's text in an image that it's really meant to communicate something, right? Imagine this image if you would have seen just this, or now you're seeing it with the text included. His name's Jim Goldberg. And he did this whole series of images where he took snapshots of people and then asked them to write on the print. So they wrote what they wanted their caption to be. Okay, so again, if we just saw this image, we would have a completely different critique than when you see it in the context of how the photographer presented it. It also made a difference that I explained to you that the person in the photograph wrote the caption. Okay, so again, when you get into more conceptual images, you know, it's important to understand more of the context if you can. What about beauty? We can get sucked in by beauty, right? It's just, I mean, it's almost hard to critique this image. It's just like, wow. So just to keep in mind that when something's really beautiful, it's very easy to be like, it's so beautiful, I love it. And that's fine to say, but then start to talk about why is it working so much? Why? I mean, yes, she's beautiful, but then you can talk about the light, the quality of light, the composition, the lines, the shapes, the expression, all those things of why it's working so much. On the other side of this is when something's not beautiful to us. And I'm not stating that this is not beautiful, but I think everybody can agree, beauty, and this is more of like a mundane, everyday scene, okay? So, you know, some images are gonna be strikingly beautiful, other images are meant to, and I'm not saying this one in particular, but some images, we've all seen them, are sort of meant to repulse, right? Or aren't about beauty, but we still need to be able to talk about those as well. And then you talk about the formal aspects and the technical choices and the content and the meaning. This is Wolfgang Tillmans, German photographer. Some images are meant to be shocking, right? This is actually an advertisement. This is Mark Zybert, the great commercial photographer. So he wants it to be shocking because there's a message, right? It says last year, 16 million gallons of oil were consumed to make plastic water bottles. So it was an advertisement. So my point is you know, if you're going to critique images and give feedback, it's really easy when an image is shocking or ugly to be like, you know, just like when we see art in a gallery, I'm guessing most of you don't because you're New Yorkers, so you're pretty awesome when it comes to art. But, you know, when we see art we don't understand, it's really easy to just be like, I don't get it, I don't like it. Or we can approach it and go, what's going on here? Okay, so I said I would talk a little bit about abstract images. So an abstract image is when the form is often simplified or magnified, or the meaning or the subject is obscured, right? Like maybe we don't know what it is. We don't know what it is. We don't know what the photographer is doing or saying. We don't understand the technique. Any of those can be obscured or unclear to us. And it can be hard to talk about abstract images because we're sort of like, oh, I don't know. So when we talk about abstract images, if we don't know what the subject is, and we don't know what the meaning is, well, what are we left with? The visual. Okay, so often with abstract images, you simply talk about the visual aspects of the image, because you might not get anything else out of it. You might be like, I don't know what it is, I don't know what you're trying to say, but I can at least tell you what I'm seeing. Line, shape, texture, color, technical choices, okay? So this is great photographer Harry Callahan. We may or may not know what it is. We may or may not know what he's trying to communicate. But what can we talk about here? I mean, you would probably immediately talk about the line. You'd probably talk about the lack of detail in black or white. You would talk about it being grayscale, right? And then you might talk about what it reminds you of or what you think of it, right?
Gesture.
Yeah, gesture, right? Balance. Okay. So again, with abstract images, if you can't tell the technique, if you don't know what it is, you just fall back on those formal aspects. And then perhaps you also get a mood or a feeling from it and talk about that, or perhaps you don't at all, and you say that. Okay? So I'm just bringing this up because I think a lot of people get turned off by images, abstract images that they don't get. And it's good to have the skill of talking about those as well. This is Uta Barth again. Aaron Siskind. So much you can still talk about without having to know what it is or what it means, right? Okay, we talked about multiple images. When images are seen together, we need to talk about them as a collective, okay? Especially diptychs and triptychs. Right? They're put together for a purpose. I'm also using these as examples because, like in the last example with the river rocks, sometimes the subjects are very similar to each other, meaning you can almost tell they're shot in the same location. And sometimes they're very disparate. And sometimes the disparate diptychs are kind of even more fun for the viewer because then you start to try to make connections between the images. There's a reason the photographer put them together, so what's the connection? Okay, so it's important in multiple images to talk about that connection, and that can be visually as far as color, scale, texture, and it can be conceptually as far as mood, idea, okay? Okay, I talked in the beginning about context and intention are important to know if we can. We can't always, okay, but this is an example. If you came to this image individually, you might be like, what's going on here? It's confusing, it's disturbing, it's funny, whatever you think it is. However, when I show you the series, okay, maybe some more pieces get filled in, but then most importantly would be the context that this is a photographer who is a father of an autistic child trying to convey what the world feels like to his autistic child. Okay, so an example where the artist statement, the titles, the understanding of the series is really important to the series. Okay, so I'm also saying that, you know, sometimes hold back judgment or try to get more information if we can to understand the context a little more. Okay? As I said earlier, if something is technically off, it needs to be addressed. Okay? I took this wedding shot. Her face is out of focus. I missed the focus. It's on her dress. It's a problem. Okay? It needs to be addressed. Her face is not in focus. Her expression's important. I missed it. Okay? What's off in this shot? Technically. White balance, totally off. You can't ignore it. And you're not hurting people's feelings. You're just being honest. The white balance is off. Okay? It should be more like this. It needs to be talked about. Right? Focus is off in this one. Me being the photographer, okay, but I think it's a little more I think it's okay in this one that the focus isn't on his eyes because it's a very shallow depth of field. It feels intentional, and it's about the connection between the man and the dog, right? Okay. I think I've sort of been saying this all along, okay? But, you know, just give reasoning and explanation for where you're coming from. But I just want to follow up with a few final suggestions. Always begin with something positive, please. And objective, maybe. You know, meaning maybe the first thing out of your mouth isn't like, oh, this is so confusing. I don't even know what it is. Maybe it's like, oh, well, I see lots of varying lines. I see this, I see that, and I'm a little confused, okay? Stay on point. It's how many times have you been in a critique where the person rolls off on, I mean, I've been in critiques in grad school where the next thing I know, we're talking about the history of feminism. And I'm like, can we talk about my image right here? What are you talking about? Okay, so it's one thing to reference Picasso or feminism or something, but then bring it back to the image. To try to stay on point. Make it about the image and not yourself. We've all been there too, right? Where the person waxed poetic for 20 minutes about what they would have done and their own images and their own experience and their own everything, okay? So we need to make it about the image. Give suggestions for how to improve in your own personal opinion, how to make it better or more communicative, and end on a positive note as well. So, you know, if we're helping someone, it really helps to begin with a positive and end on a positive. All right, everybody.